I knew who he was. The moment I saw the medical file, the name printed on the white paper made my heart beat harder than usual. Richard Bennett. For a moment, every sound in the emergency room seemed to fade into the background. The wheels of the gurney rolling across the floor, the beeping of the heart monitor, the nurses calling to each other in urgency. All of it felt distant, as if I were standing somewhere else. I stared at the name again to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Richard Bennett. 18 years ago, that name had appeared in the accident report that killed my father. Outside the glass doors of the trauma bay, a team of doctors and nurses pushed the gurney inside. The man lying on it was covered with a thin blanket, but blood had already soaked through the fabric around his abdomen. A nurse handed me the rest of the file. "Car accident on Interstate 90, she said quickly. "Internal injuries, blood pressure dropping." I nodded out of professional instinct, but my mind was still stuck on that name. Richard Bennett. A well-known real estate developer in Chicago. A wealthy man with powerful connections, appearing in newspapers more often than most politicians. And also the man whose name once appeared in the report of my father's crash. My name is Dr. Carter Hayes, a trauma surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. My job is to save people standing on the line between life and death. But I had never imagined that one day the man lying on my operating table would be someone connected to my father's death. My father, Daniel Hayes, was a traffic engineer for the city of Chicago. He was the kind of man who believed that truth and law would always win in the end. 18 years ago, a car slammed into his vehicle on Interstate 90 during a rainy night. The police said it was an accident. But I had always felt something wasn't right. A witness once said the other car was speeding. Later, that witness disappeared from the records. The case was closed quickly. When I was younger, I thought I might become a lawyer one day and reopen that case. But life led me to a different path. I became a doctor. Partly because I wanted to save lives, and partly because my father always said helping others was the most valuable thing a person could do. "Doctor, we're losing him," a nurse said. Her voice pulled me back to reality. I looked up. Richard Bennett was breathing heavily, his skin pale. Blood was still filling his abdominal cavity. Without immediate surgery, he would die within an hour. I grabbed the lab report and scanned it quickly. Ruptured spleen, internal bleeding, rapidly dropping blood pressure. There was no time to think too much. "Prepare the OR," I said. The nurses moved immediately. Within minutes, we were inside the operating room. The cold white surgical lights shone down on Richard Bennett's unconscious body. I washed my hands, put on my gloves, and stood at the table. In that brief moment, a thought crossed my mind. A small mistake. A delay of a few seconds. This man could die right here. No one would ever prove anything. I looked down at his face. A man who had lived his life surrounded by power and money. A man who might have destroyed my family. I closed my eyes for 1 second. And then I remembered my father's voice. "Character is what you do when nobody is watching." I opened my eyes. "Scalpel," I said. The surgery lasted nearly 3 hours. We controlled the bleeding. The damaged spleen was treated. Blood vessels were carefully sutured one by one. When the heart monitor finally stabilized, I knew he would live. I removed my gloves and stepped out into the hospital hallway. Outside the window, snow was falling softly over the city of Chicago. The man lying in the ICU had just been saved by me. The man who might have killed my father. And for the first time in many years, I realized that the story of my father's death might not be over yet. I always felt that something was wrong with what they called my father's accident. That feeling never disappeared, even after 18 years. That night is still very clear in my memory, like a film stuck in my mind that cannot be fast-forwarded. It was raining heavily. Raindrops struck the windows of our apartment on the north side of Chicago, forming long streaks of water sliding down the glass. I was studying for my final exams at college when the phone rang. It was a call from the hospital. The moment I heard the voice on the other end of the line, I knew something was wrong. The man told me my father had been involved in a crash on Interstate 90. Another car had slammed directly into his vehicle. By the time I arrived at the hospital, it was too late. My father lay on the hospital bed, covered with a white sheet up to his chest. The heart monitor had been turned off. There was no sound in that small room except the rain falling outside the window. My mother sat beside the bed, holding my father's hand tightly. She was not crying. That frightened me more than tears. A police officer stood at the end of the room. He introduced himself as an officer from the Chicago Police Department and said the incident was under investigation. According to the initial report, the other vehicle had lost control in the rain and crashed into my father's car. An accident. Just an accident. But even then, when I was still too young to understand everything, something made me doubt that explanation. My father was an extremely careful driver. He was a traffic engineer. He understood roads and safety better than anyone I had ever known. The idea that he had simply been involved in a random accident always felt wrong. A few days after the funeral, a stranger came to see my mother. He said he had witnessed the crash. He said the other car had been driving very fast. Too fast for a wet road at night. He also said the driver seemed to have been drinking. My mother immediately asked the police to investigate again. But when we called the police department weeks later, they said there were no witnesses in the file. The man's name did not appear anywhere. There was also no record that the driver had been drinking. The official report contained only a simple sentence. Driver lost control due to wet road conditions. And the case was closed. Very quickly. Too quickly. After that, I began hearing the name Richard Bennett. At first, I only saw it in newspapers. Articles about large real estate developments in Chicago, new skyscrapers, multi-million-dollar deals. His photo often appeared beside those articles. A middle-aged man in expensive suits with a confident smile. A man whom the whole city seemed to know. Then one day, when I looked again at the accident report of my father, I saw that name. Richard Bennett. The driver of the other car. I remember exactly how I felt at that moment. It was like a missing piece falling into place. A wealthy man. A suspicious crash. A case closed too quickly. But I had no proof. Only a feeling. Time passed. My mother tried to continue her life. She returned to work and tried to keep things as normal as possible. As for me, I carried that question for many years. I once thought I would become a lawyer, reopen the case and find the truth. But life turned in a different direction. I went to medical school. I spent many years learning how to save lives. Maybe partly because I could not save my father. Maybe partly because I wanted to believe the world could still be fair. And now, after 18 years, that man is lying in the intensive care unit of the hospital where I work. Richard Bennett. The man I believe caused my father's death. The man I saved only a few hours ago. I stand in front of the glass window of the ICU, looking inside. He is still unconscious. The ventilator gently lifts and lowers his chest. The soft green light from the heart monitor reflects on his face. In that moment, I realize something. All the questions of the past 18 years may finally have answers soon. I have an opportunity that very few people ever get. The opportunity to stand in front of the man I believe destroyed my family, and know that his life was once in my hands. 3 days have passed since the surgery. Richard Bennett is still lying in the intensive care unit of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, but his condition has become more stable. The ventilator has been removed, and his vital signs are gradually returning to normal. Every time I walk past the ICU, I look through the glass window. He still has not woken up. Part of me feels relieved about that. Another part feels uneasy, because when he wakes up, I will have to face something I have been waiting for 18 years. The truth. During those days, I could not stop thinking about my father's accident. Memories I had tried to bury for many years began returning more clearly than ever. After my shift that night, I did not go home immediately. Instead, I went to the hospital's records archive. I wanted to review everything related to the accident from years ago. Some documents had been digitized, but many older records were still stored in large paper boxes stacked on metal shelves. It took me almost an hour to find the box containing reports related to my father's accident. When I opened it, I felt a familiar sensation in my chest. A feeling that was both painful and determined. I began reading each document again. Scene reports, accident photographs, autopsy reports. Everything looked exactly the same as what I had seen many years ago. But this time I read them with different eyes. The eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to notice details. A small detail can save or take a patient's life. After nearly 2 hours of reviewing the records, I began to notice something. Some things did not match. One report stated that Richard Bennett's car had been taken to a repair garage on the same night the accident happened. But in the official investigation file, that detail was never mentioned. I continued reading. Then I found another document, a blood test report. The first one was time-stamped only a few hours after the crash. It clearly stated, blood alcohol level detected. But right behind it was another report, the one submitted to the official file. In that version, the line mentioning alcohol had disappeared. I read both reports several times. The dates were the same. The case numbers were the same. But the content was different. Someone had changed the record. I sat quietly in the silent archive room, staring at the 2 sheets of paper in front of me. For many years, I had only had a feeling that my father's accident was not random. But now, for the first time, I had something that looked like evidence. I closed the archive box and left the records room. The hospital hallway was almost empty at that hour. Fluorescent lights shone down on the cold, white floor. I returned to the ICU. Richard Bennett was still lying there, motionless. The green light of the heart monitor blinked steadily. I stood in front of the glass window and looked at him. A man whom the whole city saw as a symbol of success. A man who had built skyscrapers and signed multi-million-dollar contracts. But now, he was only a patient lying helplessly in a hospital bed. In that moment, I understood that life sometimes has strange ways of forcing people to face the past. If he had not had that accident, if he had not been brought to the very hospital where I work, if I had not been the surgeon on duty that night, I might never have found those documents. I placed my hand on the glass of the ICU room. Inside me, the blind anger of many years was no longer there. Only one question remained, and one determination. If Richard Bennett truly caused my father's death, this time, the truth will not be buried again. There was one name that appeared several times in the accident file of my father. Samuel Ortega. I had seen that name before, but I had never really paid attention to it. In the original investigation report, he was listed as the detective assigned to the scene from the Chicago Police Department. 18 years ago, he was the first officer to arrive at the crash site. That evening, after reviewing the documents in the archive room, I decided to find him. It was not easy. After many years, many police officers had retired or transferred. But after a few phone calls and some searching through the city's internal database, I found information that Samuel Ortega had retired nearly 8 years earlier. His address led me to a quiet neighborhood in Logan Square, on the northwest side of Chicago. The afternoon was cold. Snow from the previous day still covered the sidewalks. The cars parked along the street were coated with a thin layer of ice. I stood in front of a small red brick house. I hesitated for a few seconds before knocking on the door. An older man opened the door a few minutes later. He was probably in his 60s, his hair mostly gray, but his eyes were still sharp. "Can I help you?" he asked. "My name is Carter Hayes," I said. I saw his expression change the moment he heard that name. I continued. "Daniel Hayes was my father." The silence lasted a few seconds. Ortega opened the door wider. "You should come in," he said. Inside, the small house felt much warmer than the cold outside. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Family photos hung on the walls, mixed with a few old pictures of him wearing his police uniform. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. I did not waste time. "I reviewed the accident file," I said. "I think something was covered up." Ortega looked down at the table for a few seconds before answering. "You're like your father," he said slowly. "He never gave up easily either." I felt my heart beating faster. "So what happened that night?" I asked. Ortega sighed. We knew it wasn't a simple accident. That sentence made the room feel even quieter. He stood up, walked to a small cabinet in the living room, and took out an old folder. "This isn't the official one," he said as he placed it on the table. But I kept a copy. I opened the folder. The first page was the original scene report. My father's car had been hit at a very high speed. The angle of impact showed that the other vehicle had exceeded the speed limit. I turned to the next page. A handwritten note. Driver appeared intoxicated. Strong smell of alcohol. I looked up at Ortega. "But this detail isn't in the official report," I said. He nodded. "Because it was removed." A cold sensation ran down my spine. "Who did that?" Ortega gave a bitter smile. "Bennett's lawyers." He explained that only a few hours after the accident, Richard Bennett's attorneys arrived at the police station. They said Bennett was a major businessman, a man with influence in the city. They said that if the case became a scandal, it would cause political trouble. After that, everything began to change. The alcohol report disappeared. The witness was no longer in the file, and the case was reclassified as an accident caused by weather conditions. "We protested," Ortega said. But there were phone calls from above. Phone calls from higher authorities. Orders he could not fight. I looked down at the folder in front of me. For many years, I had only felt that my father's death was not random. But now I knew it for certain. Richard Bennett had been driving drunk, and the system had protected him. I looked up at Ortega. "Why did you keep these documents?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because I always knew that one day, someone would come back looking for the truth." He pushed the folder toward me. "Maybe that day is today." When I left Ortega's house, it was already dark. The yellow streetlights illuminated the snow-covered street. I stood beside my car for a few minutes before opening the door. In my hands was the first real evidence. Not just a feeling, not just a memory, but the truth. And for the first time in 18 years, I knew that my father's death might finally be brought into the light. There are moments in life when everything seems to start moving at once. That was the feeling I had on the morning of the 5th day after Richard Bennett's surgery. Chicago was still cold. Snow from last week's storm had not yet melted from the sidewalks. When I walked into Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the gray light of early morning filtered through the large glass windows of the main lobby. I had just finished a long overnight shift, but my mind felt more awake than usual. Because inside the folder I carried were the copies that Samuel Ortega had given me. Documents that could change everything. After the morning shift, I did not go home. Instead, I went to the office of the Cook County State's Attorney. I had called earlier to request a short meeting. I did not know whether they would seriously consider the case, but I knew this was the only next step. The person who met me was a prosecutor named Emily Carter. She was in her early 30s, her brown hair tied neatly behind her head, and she had the eyes of someone used to hearing difficult stories. She opened the folder I brought and read it very carefully. For nearly 10 minutes, she said nothing. Only the sound of pages turning filled the small office. Finally, she looked up at me. "Where did these documents come from?" she asked. "From a retired detective," I said. "Samuel Ortega. He was at the scene that night." Emily nodded slightly. "I know his name." She turned back to the page with the handwritten note about alcohol. "This is not enough to file charges," she said. That answer did not surprise me. But she continued. "But it is enough for us to begin reviewing the case again." I felt something in my chest grow lighter. For 18 years, my father's crash had been nothing more than a closed file. Now, at least, it had begun to open. Emily closed the folder. "We will need more than this," she said. "Witnesses, original reports, and if possible, a confession." I knew what she meant. But that was almost impossible. Richard Bennett was a wealthy and powerful man. Men like him do not easily confess to anything. I left the prosecutor's office around noon. Cold wind rushed between the tall buildings of downtown Chicago. Yellow taxis moved through the crowded streets. In my mind, there was only one thought. If justice truly exists, it has to begin somewhere. And maybe it would begin at the hospital. When I returned to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, something in the ICU felt different. A nurse saw me and quickly walked over. "Dr. Hayes," she said, "Patient Bennett just woke up." In that moment, time seemed to slow. 18 years of questions. 18 years of suspicion. 18 years of waiting. And now the man had opened his eyes. I stood outside the ICU room for a few seconds before entering. Richard Bennett lay in the hospital bed, looking far weaker than the image of him I had seen in newspapers. His skin was pale. IV tubes ran from his arm to the medical machines beside him. He turned his head when he heard footsteps. His eyes stopped on me. "Doctor," he said softly. His voice was hoarse and weak. "I survived?" I stood still for a few seconds before answering. "You went through a serious surgery," I said, "but you will recover." He studied my face more carefully, as if trying to remember something. "Thank you, doctor," he said. In that moment, I realized something. He did not recognize me yet. He did not recognize the name Hayes. He did not realize the past was standing in front of him. I looked at him for a few more seconds. In my mind, I heard the words of Emily Carter. A confession. But I said nothing. Not yet. I turned and walked out of the ICU room. The door closed behind me with a soft click. In the hallway, I stood still for a long moment. Because I knew one thing. The real confrontation had only just begun. There are confrontations in life that you know will happen sooner or later. You can delay them, you can walk around them, but eventually you must walk straight into them. I knew that confrontation was waiting behind the ICU door. Richard Bennett was awake. And this time, I could no longer remain outside the hallway as an anonymous doctor. 2 days after he woke up, Bennett's condition had improved significantly. The doctors in the department said he might be transferred to a regular recovery room within a few days. That meant my time was limited. If I wanted to hear the truth from his own mouth, it had to be now. That afternoon, when the ICU hallway became quieter, I returned to his room. I stood outside the door for a few seconds. My hand rested on the door handle. Many images flashed through my mind. My father laughing in our small kitchen. My father teaching me how to drive for the first time. My father standing at the front door that morning. Before he left and never came back. I opened the door. Richard Bennett was sitting slightly upright in his hospital bed. Afternoon light came through the window behind him. When he saw me enter, he nodded slightly. "Dr. Hayes," he said. Someone must have told him the name of the surgeon. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Weak," he answered, "but alive." He looked around the room for a moment before looking back at me. "Doctor, you saved my life." I did not respond immediately. I pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. For a few seconds, we simply looked at each other. Then I said a sentence I had thought about for many years. "Do you remember a crash on Interstate 90 18 years ago?" Bennett frowned slightly. "A crash?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "A car hit head-on during a rainy night." He remained silent. I continued. "The driver of the other car was named Daniel Hayes." That name seemed to change the air inside the room. Bennett looked at me more closely. I saw recognition beginning to appear in his eyes. "My name is Carter Hayes," I said. "His son." For the next few seconds, no one spoke. I saw Bennett's face tighten. He looked down at his hand, where the IV line was still connected to his vein. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "You didn't know?" I asked. I could not hide the coldness in my voice. "You drove the car that killed my father." Bennett closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his voice was lower. "I remember that night," he said. "But everything is very blurry." I said nothing. I just looked at him. After a long moment, Bennett sighed. "I had been drinking," he said. Those words fell into the room like a stone. "I had just left a party," he continued. "It was raining heavily. I thought I could still control the car." He stopped speaking. But I was wrong. I felt my heart beating strongly in my chest. 18 years. 18 years of waiting. And finally, I was hearing him say it. After the crash, Bennett continued, my lawyers said they would handle everything. I never saw the file again. I just tried to forget. I looked at him. My father didn't get the chance to forget, I said. The room became silent. Bennett turned his head toward the window. Outside, the city of Chicago continued moving as it always did. After a few minutes, he looked back at me. Dr. Hayes, he said, why did you still save me? That question made me pause. I thought about the surgery, about the moment I held the scalpel in my hand, about the opportunity I had. I stood up. I saved you, I said slowly, because I am a doctor. I paused for a second. And because this time, the truth will not be hidden again. I walked out of the room. But this time, I knew one thing. The real battle had begun. After my conversation with Richard Bennett, I knew everything had changed. For 18 years, my father's death had been only a painful memory and an unanswered question. But now it had become a truth that at least two people clearly knew. Me and Richard Bennett. That night, I could not sleep. The words he said kept repeating in my mind. I had been drinking. A simple sentence. But it could change the entire story of what happened 18 years ago. The next morning I called Emily Carter. She asked me to come to her office immediately. When I walked into her office at the Cook County State's Attorney's office, Emily was standing by the window, looking down at the heavy traffic on the street. I'm guessing you have something new, she said when she turned around. I spoke with Bennett, I replied. Emily immediately sat down. Did you record it? I nodded. The night before entering the ICU room, I had turned on the recording function on my phone. I placed the phone on the table. Emily listened to the entire recording without saying a word. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair. That's a confession, she said. I said nothing. For many years, I had imagined this moment. But when it actually happened, the feeling was different. Not satisfaction. Only a strange calm. Emily began writing notes. We will need to verify this confession, she said. But combined with Ortega's records, we can reopen the case. A few days later, the news began to spread. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune called the prosecutor's office. Some old records were requested for review. And then the name Richard Bennett began appearing in the media again. But this time, not in articles about real estate. Instead, in a criminal investigation. A week later, Richard Bennett was transferred from the hospital to the Cook County Courthouse. I had no obligation to be present at the hearing, but I still went. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected. Reporters filled the seats in the back rows. Cameras and recording devices were placed on the tables. Bennett entered the courtroom slowly, walking beside his lawyer. He looked much older than the image I had seen in newspapers. More tired. And for the first time, perhaps, no longer powerful. The hearing began. Emily Carter stood and presented the case. She spoke about the crash 18 years earlier. About the altered records. About the confession. Bennett's lawyers tried to object. They said Bennett was still recovering from surgery. They said his memory might not be accurate. But then Emily played the recording. Bennett's voice echoed through the courtroom. I had been drinking. I had just left a party. I thought I could still control the car.